Okay, so I'm a 16-year-old male, and I live in the suburbs on the East Coast in a town with a population of about 25,000 people. It was a normal night a couple years ago. I don't remember exactly what I was doing that night, except that I was on my way home when this happened. I was in the car with my dad and my little brother. My dad is an alcoholic and used to verbally and physically abuse my whole family. And as much as I'd love to divulge into the horror of my upbringing, this is the only detail relevant because even though my father is now sober, I'm still very uncomfortable around him. But my little brother was too young to remember much from when he was abusive and is much closer with him now. So, when we ride in the car, my brother sits in the front with my dad talking about whatever, and I sit in the back listening to music with my headphones, falling into my own thoughts while staring out the window. This night, while I was on my way home, was no different. I remember we were almost back, maybe about 5 minutes away, and we were coming up on passing a church, and I got immediate goosebumps when I laid my eyes on it. Then, I was rushed into an overwhelming feeling of terror and couldn't look away from the church as we grew nearer and nearer, fearing something bad would happen if I did. Now I listen to horror story narrations, read all kinds of things on Reddit, love horror movies, go to every haunted house in my area, and spend lots of time outside late at night when the weather permits it, going to the woods and abandoned places with my friends. So, this unexpected feeling of terror on a completely normal night, surrounded by what I knew as the safe place I grew up in, was very unusual. As we get closer to the church, I see two deer in front of its lawn. One is lying on its side and the other is standing, and it has its head bent towards the other's stomach. The deer on its side is dead, and the other deer has giant black horns that looked similar to the ones in the Marvel movie Thor Ragnarok. They were absolutely massive, and it looked like the deer shouldn't have been able to support their weight. I am frozen in fear when I realize the one is standing up is devouring the dead one, and as we passed by it, it looked up at me, straight in the eyes. It felt cold and angry, and I knew any intentions this thing had were, obviously, malicious. This is weird, but locking eyes with it almost made me feel like it knew me, like it stared into my soul and explored every nook and cranny in my brain. Thinking about that feeling still sends a shiver down my spine, because it was so unnatural, uncomfortable, and terrifying. But you could say that to describe everything about this creature. The skin had begun to rot off its face, and I could see part of its skull. It had sharp, shiny teeth and was covered in blood. My father and brother didn't notice anything, and I thought maybe I was seeing things. But that primal fear convinced me it was real, because I've never felt any kind of fear as real as what this felt like. I was truly scared for my life. In those few moments passing by, this thing, I could feel its rage. It was almost tangible, and it felt awful. I knew that it wanted to kill anything or anyone, and it would do anything for the satisfaction. I believe me noticing its presence made me on its next immediate target list, which would explain why I was the only one affected by its presence. My father and brother both unalarmed enough to not even notice it. But thank God I was in the car when we passed it that night. The night went on as usual. I couldn't stop thinking about it though, so I went to the church the next day early in the morning and found the dead deer. All of its fur was skinned off, and it had a huge hole in it. Upon looking inside, I saw that its body was completely hollow. No blood, no organs, nothing. But it wasn't flat. It looks like everything was still intact, that it just died and had no fur. It was gone before the day was over. I still have no idea what happened that night, but I haven't seen anything similar since this, and I don't know if it was a skinwalker or not. All I know is it scared the hell out of me, and I hope to never see anything like it again. My family and I are Native Americans from the Navajo tribe, so we have a lot of strange, unexplainable things happen to us involving skinwalkers. This is one of many stories. This happened 4 months ago. My uncle Andre lives all alone in a trailer park with his older brother David, who lives right next door to him. That night before, Andre was watching TV when he heard something. He said it sounded like somebody running up and down his house. He listened to it for a while, before he texted my uncle David to look out his window to see if he saw something. When David looked out, he said he saw something like a man running on Andre's house. David, being a fearless older brother, ran out just in time to see a black shadow jump 11, maybe 13 feet to the ground. He followed it until he stopped at a tree line, where he lost it. He had a flashlight with him and shined the light till he saw a reflected eyes looking back at him. The figure looked like it was crouching down, trying to hide from David. He then heard a sound to his side. For a second, he looked toward the sound before snapping his head back at the figure, only to find it gone. Whatever it was, no normal creature could jump up and down 11 or 13 feet off the ground and onto a trailer without a ladder or breaking its legs. Okay, so I was about 14 at the time, and I grew up pretty poor. My mother at this time was really slowly disappearing from my life, and where I was later on homeless. But at this time, she was still around, and we were sleeping on the kitchen floor, as it was the comfiest floor in the house. I regularly get night terrors and sleep paralysis, but this time it felt different. I woke up immediately, feeling like I was being watched. I found it hard to breathe. I was just so terrified. Everything in my mind told me to not open my eyes, but being as curious as I am, I opened them anyway. What I saw I'll never forget. I saw this creature. It looked to be about 7 feet tall, but somehow fit into our small apartment hallway. Its bones were all deformed and broken, but it didn't look like it was in any pain. At this point, I had sat up and started to move backwards, away from this thing. It was all white and didn't have hair anywhere. There was something draining from its mouth when it would move nearer to me. I could hear this thing's bone cracking. I closed my eyes, hoping it would go away, but I could still hear it. I started actually screaming, and my mother woke up and yelled at me for my screaming, but I told her what was happening, and when I opened my eyes, it was gone. My mother continues to insist I'm lying, but I swear what I saw that night was real, and it wasn't human. To start, I should probably tell you that I am a third Native American. I have always been a bit sensitive to the supernatural. A couple of weeks ago, I worked an odd shift, 3 p.m. to 3 a.m. After work, I decided that I was going to go to the local Native reservation for cigarettes and gas. When I had finished getting gas, I was a little bit too tired to drive. I decided to take a nap in the darker corner of the parking lot. I faded off into a sleep. At 4:37, I was awoken by a howl, like a wolf, but more like a man mimicking a wolf. I look out front of my car, and there it is, a wolf-like man, white in color, standing around 50 to 60 feet in front of my car. It slowly walked towards me. I started the car and put it in reverse. I decided to get out of there. As I was leaving, it scratched the trunk of my car. It's been 3 weeks since then, and I am working my normal shift at work, 6 p.m. to 6 a.m. I have seen it in many places since, and feel it getting closer to me. I talked to the local native chief, and he says that if it is following me, like this, that it might be hunting me, or that it could be trying to protect me from something more dangerous. He also told me that he can do nothing to help me. My name's Cody, and I'd been a paramedic about 5 years at the point that this story takes place. I originally joined the department to be a fireman, but after about a year, I'd realized that being a paramedic full-time was more enjoyable to me, and after discussion with my captain and a buttload of training, he agreed I could stay a paramedic as long as there were no manpower shortages elsewhere. Since then, I've spent every working day on a bus, doing the best job in the world, at least in my opinion. However, you're not reading this to hear my life story. Instead, you're here to read about one of the most horrific things I've ever seen on my job. The night it happened had been just like any other. There are occasional shifts where everything seems to go haywire, but those are rare, and we hadn't experienced one in quite some time. My normal shift was days, but I had been switched to nights after one of the old-timers had retired. Fortunately, I was riding with one of the only two guys I could stand. The rest of our crew was filled with jacked-up jocks and drama queens. That night I was working with Donald, probably the funniest guy in the department and my favorite guy to work with. Our first call of the night was a GSW in a rougher part of town. We arrived before the PD, and since our protocol was to never enter an active shooting situation, we were forced to sit and wait for them to arrive and clear the scene. After a very long 15 minutes, we were finally allowed to enter the apartment where the shooting had taken place. And, just as we had feared, the victim was already dead. And yes, I am aware that I started a paragraph saying this night was like any other. Unfortunately, things such as this are all too common in my city. Despite the rough start to the night, the calls that took place in the following few hours went far better. We managed to stabilize this poor little boy that was having an asthma attack. These things are often made worse by stressful situations, and the boy's mother was doing the poor kid no favors. Once we were able to get him alone in the bus, he responded much better to treatment. By the time we had arrived at the ER, the attack was all but over. That call was probably the highlight of the shift. Patients like that are the main reason I love my job so much. Helping others at times when they need it most gives me a supreme sense of achievement. There aren't many jobs that can do that for you anymore. The remainder of the calls that night went smoothly, mainly trip and falls and minor fender benders. All of them except the last. Stuff was winding down and we only had about an hour left. I was writing shotgun and going through the run sheets and double checking them. We had just dropped off a drunk college girl that had been hit by a car full of more drunken college girls. None of the injuries were a big deal. After checking out all those involved in the incident, the driver and her passengers checked out fine, and the girl that was hit was left with appeared to be just a sprained ankle. Of course, the girl driving got to spend the night in jail. On the way out of the hospital parking lot, we received a call to meet the police department at the address of an elderly person for a wellness check. Generally, we didn't accompany the police on wellness checks, but since the citizen involved was diabetic and had a heart condition, we had been asked to tag along. Those of you reading this that are unaware of what a wellness check is, the police receive a call from a family member or a neighbor requesting the police to check on somebody to ascertain their situation. Basically, they ask the police to make sure their loved one is doing okay, living or not a danger to themselves, that kind of stuff. Anyway, we met the two officers outside the subject's apartment, who, in this case, was a 77-year-old widow who lived alone with an army of cats. As we stood outside the door waiting for somebody to open it, the faint smell of decomposition hung strong in the air of the cramped hallway. If the fact she didn't answer the door after 5 solid minutes of knocking was about enough, the smell of a decomposing body confirmed our darkest suspicions. Once the handyman returned with a key and let us in the apartment, the officers entered to secure the scene and determine the status of the subject of the check. In a matter of seconds, the younger of the two officers stormed back out into the hallway, retching uncontrollably. Donald and I shared a look of bewilderment. It had been quite a long time since I remember seeing a cop getting sick at a scene. I figured it had to be very bad in there, and I wasn't wrong. The second officer came out a few seconds later holding a handkerchief over his face and gave us the okay wave with his head. One step into the door, I was hit with an overbearing stench of cat pee, the universal perfume of the crazy cat lady. The smell came close to overpowering the decomposition, and the combination of the two made me a bit queasy. Donald went ahead of me while I put my bag down to dig out my flashlight. About that time, a cat zipped between my legs and out the door. I could only shake my head and hope I never ended up like this poor woman. I noticed Donald standing ahead of me, looking down at something with a horrified look on his face. A couch blocked whatever it was, but I could only assume it was the DB of the lady. His look did surprise me, considering we had both seen more than our share of corpses, and some of those had been beyond gnarly. I heard him mumble the words, "Dude, nasty," under his breath, and that only managed to make me even more curious. Just looked up at me and said, "You gotta see," and turned around and walked out of the room. He was shook in a way I'd never seen him, and I wasn't sure I wanted to see it, but that was my job, so with a knot in my stomach, I walked down the hall and into the living area. When I walked past the couch, I slowly looked down and saw the most horrible sight I have ever, and hope will ever, see again. I reluctantly pulled out my flashlight and shone it down on her, so I could get a clearer look in the dark room. Her body had that deflated look and almost black color that corpses take on once they reached advanced decomposition. But that wasn't the bad part. From what I could tell, her face had been chewed up and eaten, but what I can only guess were the cats. She must have been dead for at least 2 or 3 weeks, and I assume when the cats ran out of food, they turned to the next option, her dead body. While I was crouched over her, I couldn't help but feel like I was being watched. I stood up, stifling the taste of bile seeping into my mouth, and turned to look for what was causing it. As I scanned the dark room with my light, what seemed like hundreds of little red eyes peered back at me from dark corners under furniture. A chill slowly passed through me, and I ran from the room, back into the hall to call the coroner and animal control. Me and Donald stood in the hall with the 2 officers. We all shared a few shocked looks, but nothing was said until the coroner showed up. We made sure to warn him and his assistant about the state of her face, but unless you saw it for yourself, no one could really understand how horrid it looked. The 2 of them came out of the apartment just a few moments later, rolling her body on a gurney, and thank God it was in a bag. I just wasn't ready to see that again. All I can say is, I hope that poor lady was dead when those furry little monsters attacked her. Donald and I followed the coroner to his van, and once her body was loaded, I asked him point blank what he thought had happened. He looked me in the face almost nonchalantly. As far as I can tell, she had a cardiac event and was probably fed on by the cats. Her body's been in that apartment for at least a month, maybe longer considering it's winter and the heat wasn't on. The poor little things got hungry, and she was the only thing left to eat. The last thing I saw, those horrid creatures as were poor little things. He continued by saying that this was not his first time to come across something like this, and added that there had been a big story in the UK where something very similar had happened just recently. We pulled away from the scene about the time animal control showed up. I certainly did not envy those guys. From what I heard later, they spent the rest of the night in that cramped little place and ended up coming out there with 22 full-grown cats and a litter of kittens. I never found out if any of those little monsters were ever adopted out, but I know for sure I'll never let my kids bring home one, no matter how much they beg me. Okay, first off, I know a lot of people will think this is a hoax because it's in Scotland, but I don't know how to explain this. I'm extremely familiar with Wendigos, Skinwalkers, Fleshgates, all that crap, and there is probably a non-Native American possibility that I'm unaware of, but the only explanation to me is a Skinwalker. I apologize for my use of Scots slang in advance. I'm a teenager and I won't disclose my age, and I go to a public high school in Perthshire, Scotland. It's mostly a rural area with mostly towns, villages, and just houses dotting the landscape. Although there are 2 major cities in my area. The high school I go to is in a medium-ish sized town, and for privacy reasons, I won't disclose its name. Not many people have had many paranormal encounters, although a few people claim to have seen ghosts and whatnot. Anyway, on to my encounter. I live in a large-ish house in the middle of a field with my family. It's not too far from the town I go to school in, but I usually take the bus, and just 'cause I'm a lazy git. Sometimes, me and my mates, let's call them E, J, and C, take a path through a nearby forest to come back to my place, where we just play video games, that sort of shit. This particular night, my parents were out of town, and we decided to drink a bit of booze that we had in the mini fridge in my room. I didn't try much, since I'm not much of a drinker, and beer's not really my thing. Or C's, really. E and J, however, they went all out. It got really late, or rather early, and they decided to leave and head home. I said bye to them and headed back up to my room to play some more video games. About half an hour later, I heard a loud banging on my door. It was J and E. I let them in and they started panicking. C goes home a different way to them. He lives a bit closer to me than the others. E and J said that they were walking through the woods and they saw a tall, skinny-looking bloke pelting it towards them. They panicked and legged it back to my house, while the skinny fella gave chase. My mind went back to when another friend, somewhat of a paranormal buff, told me about Wendigos and Skinwalkers. I called 999 and said that a prowler was lurking around our house and had chased my mates back to my house. I gave the operator my address and said that they'd have a car or two in my house in an hour and a half. Apparently there was a big traffic incident. In the meantime, she said, arm yourselves, lock all doors and windows, and lock yourself in a room. We did just that, grabbing knives from the kitchen and barricading ourselves inside my bedroom. After a while, we heard heavy footsteps around our house, and thinking it was the police, I peered out of the window. What I saw was much worse. It was E. It looked exactly the same as her. I knew that she was sitting, crying in my room. I freaked out and it saw me. What the hell is that? Whatever the feck was outside could speak, and it sounded exactly like Jay. It was a skinwalker. I remember the description from my other horror weirdo friend. It looked like my friend, but sounded like my other friend. It must have been confused, and that made it even scarier. We heard sirens, and the thing ran off into the woods. We told the police officers everything, and they checked it out. The officers left after saying the woods were clear, then muttered something about stupid prank callers. After they left, we heard an inhuman shriek, but still sort of human-like. We didn't sleep at all that night. I believe that what we saw was a skinwalker. I hope to God Almighty that I never have to face that bloody thing again. However, if I do, I shall make a follow-up. Thank you. Hello, I'm a 21-year-old guy from Denmark. Back in 2017, I was going for a vacation road trip in the US. We started off in Las Vegas, where my mom visited and an old woman she lived with for a year, back when she was 16 and an exchange student. We then drove to LA, then Arizona, New Mexico, Texas, and finally, Louisiana. I was very into true scary stories, especially enjoy cryptid and unexplained creatures and skinwalkers and wendigos, and I told my family about it. But my sister and her boyfriend teased me about believing in such nonsense. My dad doesn't believe in God or superstitions or anything, but has some strange things that have happened to him, so he is a little more open-minded, which my mom also, because she have experienced paranormal stuff. when we were driving through the deserts of Arizona. My dad had to have a smoke, and we wanted to stretch our legs. We got out of the car, and my dad started smoking, and we looked around. Then suddenly my sister says, "What is that?" and pointed towards the desert, where we immediately noticed a lion-sized, totally black cat. Like it was so black that it absorbed the light. It was just walking. It had a really long and thick tail, and it walked so freaking weird, like it was a robot, just totally stiff legs. Then it noticed us and just froze, and turned its head really fast, and just stared. Then I turned its body without moving its head, and started walking our direction. Then I said that we should probably get in the car and get moving, because I wasn't staying around for it to reach us. My family quickly agreed, and we hurried to get in the car and take off. For the rest of the trip, my sister's boyfriend and my sister didn't tease me about any unexplainable creatures anymore. We were really agitated by this thing. I started Googling and searching about animals that live in Arizona, and I couldn't find anything about a big-ass feline that was black anywhere in the world. The only big cats I could find were jaguars, and it's rare they get black and not that black. It was also much larger than a jaguar. And jaguars, cougars, and mountain lions live in forested areas, and definitely not in the middle of dirt or cacti. I still think about this a lot, and I've never found an answer to what this exactly was. And I believe even more now that there are creatures of this world we don't know about. I don't remember the year, but this is an experience that I clearly remember. It was around midnight when I hear a voice calling my name. The voice belonged to my dad. Here's the conversation. "My name," says my dad. "What?" I respond. "Come down here," my dad replies. I slowly get out of bed and go downstairs. The coffee table we used was in the kitchen, and my dad is nowhere to be seen. My sisters come down and I tell them what I heard. They said that my mom and dad were both asleep. I went to see for myself, and it's true. Both my parents were sound asleep. I just forget about it for the night and go back to sleep. I tell my parents about what happened in the morning, but they don't really have an explanation. Now, either the man upstairs was talking to me, or it could have also been a skinwalker. I know skinwalkers can use the voice of someone you know to lure you, and whatever it used my dad's voice. What do you think? February 15th. I was walking back home after hanging out with some friends of mine. Before anyone asks me, I was completely sober and in my right mind. I have never been afraid to walk alone in the dark. I'm quite tall and intimidating looking from a distance, and I always bring a pocket knife when I know I'll be walking alone in the dark. Anyway, I was walking past some woods on the way back to my house, and I heard my mother's voice call, "Gabriel, help!" from inside the woods. I immediately recognized her voice and turned to look into the woods. She kept calling my name over and over, but I couldn't see anything. It was far too dark to see through the trees. "Mom!" I called back, heading towards the woods. She sounded like she was in trouble and scared. I assumed that she had gone for a run like she did every night and somehow got lost in the woods. Then I realized it couldn't be her. She had texted me only 10 minutes before, asking me to come home soon to watch my little sister so she could go on a run. I stopped dead in my tracks and called my mom. The voice in the woods still calling my name and getting more frantic by the second. She picked up and I immediately asked her if she was in the woods. She said no. She was back home with my little sister. I swear to God, as soon as she said she was back home, her voice stopped calling my name from inside the woods. I was overcome with a wave of dread and fear that I had never felt before. Something in the woods was trying to lure me in, using my mother's voice, and it knew my full name, not just my nickname, which made things even scarier because the only person who calls me Gabriel is my mother. I immediately turned and ran faster than I had ever ran before back home. When I got back home, my legs felt like jello and my legs burnt. I opened the door and there was my mom sitting on the couch with my sister. I would think this is some sort of prank, but my mom isn't one for pranks. And even if she was, there's no way she could have gotten home before me without me seeing her. Alright, so I was sitting in my room, watching YouTube or some dumb stuff like that, and I suddenly recalled a past memory. I think what triggered this is me being a horror story lover. Let's read. Especially, I wanted to submit a story, but it took a while, if I remember, and I really had a scary personal experience, for I hate fake ones. I suddenly recalled past memories of mine, which gave me chills just to imagine it. I remember it was me, my mom, my brother, and my aunt and her kids. My brother was about 4 years old at the time. I would like to say I might have been 11. We were all packed into an SUV heading back from a children's museum. It was about midnight, or around that time. We were on a slightly busy highway. I'm talking maybe 2 cars every minute, so it wasn't just us. In about the middle of nowhere, at least it seemed like it. We were really around halfway in between 2 cities, maybe an hour away from the closest town. We were in the back seat, doing little kid stuff, laughing and having fun as 2 adults spoke in the front about politics or something like that. There was a large open field to the right of the car, and a tree line to the left. I mean like right up to the side of the road. When suddenly, a large, crippled, at least by the looks of it, light brown animal jumps at about 50 miles per hour from the tree line onto the road. We noticed this immediately because my mom and aunt screamed something along the lines of, "Holy shit," and screeched the car to a halt. The littler kids began screaming and crying as I sat in terror and shock, as my mom sat in confusion and fright, staring, as I did too. My aunt leaned back towards us kids and tried calming them down by saying, "It's just a kangaroo, and it's okay." Now, there's 2 reasons that this is incorrect. 1, this is southern Indiana. 2, I know damn well a kangaroo doesn't pull its hind smashed legs behind it and uses its 2 upper arms to rip its sticky self from the ground and go flying 20 feet into the air to land from one side of a 4-lane highway to the other. Right before this thing crawled at an unspeakably fast pace into the dark field, with only 2 arms dragging its blood-covered legs. I swear to God it turned and looked directly at me. Its eyes were human-like, but this one was different. Now, I just learned about skinwalkers about 1.5 years ago. I know enough about their appearance. Like I said, its whole body was light brown, but as the neck started, the hair began to look black, charcoal black, and it had a snout like a dog, but slightly longer. It had red around the bottom of its eyes and the tip of its snout. The closest thing I could relate this to is maybe if any of you have seen the trailer for Annihilation. It looked kinda like that bear creature that leans over the woman's shoulder. I asked my mother about it, and she somehow doesn't remember. Hell, I didn't remember until a little while ago. The more I think about the situation, the more I think, was it a skinwalker? Sure, it had the form of one, but it's as if this was more evil, if that's sensible. It seemed like the thing just clashed with a demon, or was maybe turning into one. I have a few questions. Why was it hurt, or looked like it was? If not, why the hell was it moving like that? Why of all people did it look at me? And why was its face all dark and more demon-like? I don't know. All I do know is that wasn't a kangaroo. Just be careful out there. Hello. I am a male in my early 20s, and I live in South Dakota, and I am an experienced Wiccan. I haven't had too many bad experiences, but there is one I can remember. There was one ritual I was wanting to try, but I need more than just me to perform it. So I invited one of my friends to help me with it, because I knew she had been wanting to learn a little bit more from somebody experienced. Just for reference, my friend was a couple years younger than me, and she was a small, patient girl with colored short hair. So, I set up a night at a local lake to perform this ritual. And I want to point out that this ritual wasn't exactly a good magic type of ritual. It wasn't dark magic by any means, but more of an in-between type of magic. So me and my friend set up a night and met at the location we had discussed. I told her what to expect and what to do. I told her that she had to do everything that I explained, or that the ritual was for nothing. So she agreed, and we began the ritual. I started by lighting a small fire and set my makeshift cauldron into the center of it. I threw the first few ingredients into the cauldron, and we started. The first quarter of our ceremony went by pretty quickly, and then I heard a bush behind me moving, and I thought it was just a small creature moving on by. So I ignored it, and we reached about halfway through the ceremony, and I heard a louder sound like branch snapping, so I was a little more nervous about my surroundings and who or what was possibly watching us. After the second interruption, I kind of sped up the process and tried to get our ritual done. After the next hour or so, I kept hearing whispers behind me, and off in the distance in the dark in front of me. At this point, my friend was starting to hear things too, and she was starting to get uncomfortable, since she wasn't as comfortable with everything as I let her just sit in front of the fire with me behind her. As she was reading out of my book of shadows, I felt someone watching us, so I told my friend to add 3 decent-sized logs to the fire to try to make it easier to see. After a few minutes, the logs finally caught on fire and lit up about 50 more yards around us, revealing a tall, slender figure just on the outside of the light of our fire. Just as I noticed the figure, so did my friend. She began shaking and she called my name without moving. She asked, "What do we do?" I told her, "Don't move. All we have to do is say a short invocation, close the book, and put out the fire." By then, the figure had glowing red eyes, and I could finally see a ragged black cloak draped over the figure with long, slender arms that were nothing but bone. Before it had the chance to move, I shouted the final words of the invocation and closed the ritual circle. My friend slammed the book shut, and I kicked sand onto the fire, extinguishing the flames. Just as the flames went out, the creature made an ear-piercing screech that seemed like it shook the whole ground. My friend was lying on the ground, covering her ears, starting to cry. I picked her up and booked it for my vehicle that was parked about 200 yards behind us, hidden behind a large row of trees. As soon as I got to my car, I threw open the driver's side door and put my friend in on the bench seat and slid her over to the passenger side. I got in, slammed the door shut. I started my vehicle and I floored it out of the trees that we were in. But just as we got into the clearing, on the outside of the trees, the figure was floating there, about 100 yards in front of my vehicle. I didn't move. I looked over at my friend, and she was still curled up in a ball crying. I didn't want this thing to hurt her, so I looked back at it, and as soon as it did, it made the same defining scream. I put my car in a first gear and floored the gas pedal to get out of there. I didn't care if I hit it, I just wanted to leave. But just as I was about to hit it, it vanished into the fog. I didn't look back, I just kept driving. We had about 5 miles before we hit pavement and were able to drive faster. It was about another 25 minutes back into town, and on the way back, my friend never said a word. I asked her if she was okay, and she just looked at me. By the time we got back into town, my friend did admit that she knew why everything happened. Apparently, her ex-boyfriend had gone to some voodoo doctor, asking him to set a dark spirit to hurt or even kill her because he was jealous of her spending so much time with me. At the end of all of this, she did become my girlfriend, and we haven't tried any new rituals for quite some time now. When I was younger, I preferred to spend time at my great-grandmother's house rather than my own that I lived in with my grandmother. Being right next door, my grandmother would often let me spend the night with my great-grandparents to get me out of her hair. My grandparents had their own bedroom on one end of the house, and on the other end was the room in which I slept whenever I visited. This bedroom was big to a 6 or 7-year-old with a large bed that had a sliding door cabinets for a headboard, and 2 large windows, one of which had a crate of older toys in it, mostly building blocks and the like, that faced the side yard which had several young pine trees. The other faced a large barn out back that housed their camper and all manner of other things. Before I can continue, I ought to mention that I'm a quarter Native American, of the Miami tribe to be specific. My mother was adopted by a family whose heritage was distinctly French, while my grandmother wanted my mother and I to have nothing to do with our heritage. My great-grandmother embraced it, never kept it from us, and even taught us a little about it. Me, far less than my mother, since I was too young to understand, much before she passed. One night when I was sleeping over at my great-grandmother's house, I woke up when the motion-detecting floodlight on the barn out back turned on. The room was flooded with light, and I could see everything clear as day. Unable to go back to sleep, I got up and decided to play with blocks until the floodlight went out and I couldn't go back to sleep. For some reason, I felt the strange urge to look out the window into the side yard. So, I climbed up on the crate under the window and peered out. There, in the side yard, was a young man. He was in his late teens, 17 to 19, with neatly cut straight black hair, nearly ear length. He wasn't dark-skinned, but he wasn't white either. He wore what looked like tan Carhartt overalls, and he appeared to be examining a young pine tree not 15 feet from the window. The tree wasn't very tall, maybe 8 or 9 feet, but the young man was carefully moving the bottom branches this way and that as if looking for something. I watched him for a minute or two, simply observing. I didn't feel frightened, rather, I was curious. Then, the young man lifted his head and looked around. When he saw me, the strangest thing happened. He looked startled, then terrified. His eyes widened so far that I could make out their whites in the low light. There's no other way to explain what occurred after that, other than the crazy sounding. He turned into a deer and bolted away into the darkness. Simply turned to his left, made to drop to all fours, and was a deer by the time what would have been his hands hit the ground. He ran off back beyond the barn. I don't remember the conversation I had with my great-grandmother about it in the morning, only that she seemed upset and was tight-lipped, and that she and my great-grandfather went out to look at the tree later in the day. They didn't find anything, and my grandmother didn't want to hear about it, so I just shrugged it off. Years later, I would learn what skinwalkers are. I would think back to that young man and how he could have been native, how his coveralls could have been deerskin. I would also think about my experience, and it didn't line up with other skinwalker encounters. I didn't feel any fear. I didn't notice a stench. No one called my name. Also, the young man seemed to be afraid of me. Then again, I suppose if I were looking for something, and I saw a small child staring at me through a window, I'd be a little freaked. As time went on, I had, for the most part, convinced myself that I had just happened to have witnessed a teen boy hunting illegally on our property, and my startling him startled the deer he was after, and my child brain just processed it strangely. That is, until I decided to bring up the concept of skinwalkers with my mother. I had told her that I could have possibly seen one when I was a child if my memory could be trusted. When she said, "Oh, so you saw the Birdman too, huh?" My belief that I'd totally misremembered a teen boy hunting was shattered. She wouldn't say much about it when I seemed confused, simply stating, "Oh, there was an old balding man who would dance around on the roof with his belt made of feathers, and when I would go out there to yell at him for being so loud, he'd smile at me and fly off as a bird. That house is on land that was tribal before the family I was adopted into moved into the area several generations ago. Artifacts coming to the surface every other time the big field behind my childhood home was plowed. Many others have had experiences there, including others of my own. Though most of the other experiences seemed surreal, seemed to be things that could be brushed off as a coincidence, or me psyching myself up to see or believe something that wasn't exactly there. But that young man who turned into a deer always sticks with me, and has led to me having zero trust of deer. And not just because they're a road hazard. I have had many other strange experiences with deer since then, but none so unbelievable as the shapeshifter in the coveralls. At the time this story takes place, I was 14, almost 15, and a sophomore in high school. I've never had a paranormal encounter in my life, but I still somewhat believed in the paranormal. This is the first close encounter I have ever had in my life. In case you don't know what a skinwalker is, they are people that can morph into an animal of their choice and originate from Navajo legends. I'll go further into depth about why I think this encounter was a skinwalker later in the story. So, I was at my cousin's house with both of my stepbrothers, and all of us were really into Nerf guns at the time. I'll refer to my cousin as T, my older stepbrother as J, and my younger as A. For our entertainment, we decided to split up into two teams and have what we called a Nerf war, very creatively. The goal of the game was to knock down both of our opponents by hitting them once with a Nerf bullet, as it was pretty difficult to accomplish. Once one person had been shot, they were out of the game and not able to be revived, and once both of them had been shot, the game had been won by the other team. Simple enough. The boundaries were a couple of blocks long, which included a nearby park that we liked to stay at and hide from the other team. Because it was getting dark, we had to leave my cousin's house soon. We decided to have another quick round. We watched as T and A ran into the direction of a nearby ditch, so J and I decided to run towards the park, which was behind us. We ran for a couple of minutes until we reached the huge fake rock that had a slide on top, and we decided to camp up there. For a few minutes, we sat there, waiting to see them try to sneak up on us because they knew that we were at the park. Jay and I noticed that there was a dog next to the jungle gym, walking around aimlessly, and we thought that maybe it was T's Chihuahua. However, we heard somebody call its name and realized that there was a guy standing in the nearby garden. Naturally, we didn't think much of him except how it was creepy that he was just standing there. I tried to rationalize and told Jay that he was probably watering the plants, despite the fact that he obviously wasn't. Before we could realize, the man was gone, but again, we thought nothing of it. Out in the field next to the park, I spotted two figures lying down next to a hill, T and A. Jay and I split up. I hid behind a row of bongos, and he hid behind a nearby rock. After a few moments of silence between us, I told him that we should move into the nearby brush and stalk them from afar, but he refused to. Out of nowhere, we heard a loud screech coming from the nearby brush. We thought it was some type of bird, specifically an eagle, but I also suspected it could be a coyote. A few moments later, I was looking up and admiring the sky when I noticed a shooting star, which I initially thought was a plane. I'm not sure whether it has any significance to the story, but you'll find out why I think it might later. From that point on, we both had very strange feelings that we were being watched by someone or something. I had very weird tingling sensations that started at my feet and went up to my chest multiple times. And Jay said he had burning chest pain that lasted for a long while, to the point where he could barely run. After we left our spot, we were going to take a route back to T's house. We heard the screech again, but it sounded like it came from where we were hiding. Ultimately, we won the match, but our parents were looking for us, and we decided to leave his house. T decided to spend the night at our house as we were waiting for him in the car. A asked if we had too heard the screech. We started to discuss what he thought it was, and we all agreed that it was some kind of eagle. However, after discussing it with T, he told us what he encountered. When they were in the field stalking us, T said he heard the screech right in his ear, which is nowhere near where we heard it. After that, he said it felt like someone was right behind him, and he turned to see what was bothering him. Right as he did, he said he was drawn into the same shooting star we saw. After we had left the park, which they weren't aware of, they said they both heard Jay's voice, calling desperately out for A, his brother, thinking he might have been hurt. T decided that he should go help, but something just felt off. They ultimately decided to go back to the house. Looking back, we learned why if they didn't make the decision, they would be as soon as dead. T said that he had the exact same feelings as we did while making his way back to the house, because I was a big fan of horror stories and had heard much about skinwalkers. I asked them if they thought it could possibly be a skinwalker, but nobody really thought so. I decided to do some research, and we all realized that a skinwalker fits the situation perfectly. First of all, an eagle is one of the most common forms that skinwalkers take, which would explain how we all thought the screech came from an eagle. Secondly, both teams heard the screech at different locations, and skinwalkers are known to move extremely quick. Third, they can morph into familiar faces and also imitate voices, which would explain how they heard Jay's voice calling out after we left the park. Lastly, they can actually dig through your mind and know what your fears are, and T always afraid of people getting hurt while we were playing. That night we were all extremely scared because of all the videos and stories we watched about skinwalkers. However, the final piece to the puzzle was when I woke up to Ace standing in the doorway crying. Our dog had died the night before in her sleep. According to one of many sources I found, I read that some skinwalkers are able to poison the loved ones of their victims after an encounter. What do you guys think? Do you think what I encountered was an actual skinwalker, or was it just a huge coincidence? When I was younger, between 3 and 11 years old, I lived in a trailer with my stepdad, my mom, and my younger brother. We lived in a very small town in northern Minnesota. The town was less than 100 people. The center of town was about a mile away. Down the street from that was 6 to 7 houses. I lived in the middle one. On the left of our trailer was the front door, our playground, a strip of border trees, and a crop field, corn to be specific. On the right of our trailer was the back door. Its door handle was broken and we didn't have the money to fix it, which led into a fenced-in area for our dogs, then another border strip of trees, a daycare on the other side, and less than a half-mile down the road was a cemetery. To the front of our house was the road and a cornfield, and to the back was our house and our backyard, which was bordered by tall, thick weeds, an empty field with a trail that led from our house to the woods, which was a little less than half a mile from our house. We were very poor at the time, which is why we could fix a lot of things in our house, even if we needed them, like the door in the back. The layout of the trailer went like this. Towards the road in the front end was my room. The furthest from anyone, a small bathroom and hallway. The front door, living room, kitchen, dining room, then a long halfway towards the back. On the left side of the hallway, more towards the back, was the kitchen, was my brother's room. Right across from that was the back door, and then in the very back was my parents' bedroom. My stepdad was pretty abusive to me, so in the middle of the night I would run away, which was more than just sneaking out and hiding under our front porch for an hour or two, and then sneaking back into my room. At one point when I had done it, my stepdad got so mad he broke our porch light. I was 7 or 8 at the time. One night was particularly bad, so I left at like midnight or 1 a.m. and went under the porch. I was there maybe 30 minutes and then I tried to go back inside. Little did I know, my stepdad was still pissed off and locked me out. At this point, I was 9 years old, so I freaked out. I started crying at the door, trying to get it open. All the lights were off inside, so it was almost pitch black outside, aside from the streetlight. I was still crying when I heard a sound coming from the woods. It sounded like crying. So I stopped, thinking I was echoing or something, but it never stopped. The crying didn't sound like an animal or anything. It sounded like someone had recorded a person crying. It really sounded like me. I panicked, fear tearing through me. I tried the door harder, but I couldn't get the door open. I'll just run to my mom's window, I had thought. As I was about to, the crying sounded closer than it had before. It was a continuous crying, but it was coming towards me. My face began to heat up, and tears started to line my vision. Back door, the words popped up in my head. The doorknob is broken, I can get in. I paused and listened to the crying. It still sounded closer to the woods than me, so I took my chance. I ran around the front of the house and paused before I reached the right side. The crying had stopped. This was my chance. It went away, or so I thought. I booked it to the fence. The latch was stuck. I tried to push it up, and just as it started to slide up, there was a whisper from the tall border weeds, no more than 15 feet away from where I was facing. "Come here. Come here." The words became stretched out, and honestly horrifying. It sounded like a very old, slow, distorted sound from a handheld recorder. I pushed the fence gate open and slammed the latch back down, ran up our decaying steps, all 2 of them, and flung open the door. I slammed it shut and pushed a heavy box in front of it. I booked it down the hallway, through the living room, and right into my room. I closed my window quietly and let the blanket fall over it so nothing could see. I turned off the lights, turned on a movie very softly, and crawled into the top of my bunk and waited out the night. I could hear walking around the trailer, and I could hear muffled whispers. "Come here." And then crying. "Go away, go away, go away." I wanted to scream at it, but I didn't want it to find me. When morning came, I told my mom about my stepdad locking me out, but not about what happened. "Who the hell do you think you are? She's 9!" My mom screamed at him. He apologized and said he thought I was inside. I knew he was lying because I did this every night, and he always saw me. My mom didn't know, however. I never snuck out after that. The next night around 10 p.m., I was sitting in my bed and I could hear coyotes out towards the cemetery. I fell asleep for a while and got up later that night, around the same time as the previous night, and went to get water from the kitchen. My stepdad was waiting for me. "Come outside, I want to talk to you." In my situation, I was mortified. I was about to be outside with that thing and my horrid stepdad. We went out to the front porch. I was waiting for the degrading to start. It never did. We stood out there for about 10 minutes in silence, watching the stars in the sky. Off in the distance, we could hear what sounded like coyotes from before. Only this time it was from the field behind our house. They sounded weird now. "That's coyotes. They're hunting something," my stepdad said. I looked up at him and shook my head. "It doesn't sound like coyotes. It sounds weird." He gave me a knowing look and then sat down on the bench next to where I stood. I looked out towards the field. The coyotes sounded even closer. I looked back at my stepdad. He seemed like he was hesitant to tell me something. I looked back at the field again. The noises were so close this time, I swear I could hear hooves in the weeds. Goosebumps grew on my skin when I noticed them. A pair of red eyes staring at me from those exact weeds where I could hear the coyotes and the hooves. I stepped back and gasped. My stepdad looked and then put a firm hand on my shoulder and pushed me towards the front door. He got me back inside and then locked the door and the chain above it. He brought me to the kitchen and said, "Don't ever leave the house at night. It's dangerous out there." What was in the weeds? What animal has red eyes? I started quietly crying and told him about the previous night. He pulled me in and hugged me. "You're not old enough to know right now. Just promise me you won't ever go out at night again.